So my name is Ruth Doyle and I'm joined by my colleague Saoirse Gleeson here. We both work for a company called MCO and we're going to be managing the webinar today, and we're managing the public consultation for this particular project. We are joined by a couple of key members from the project team here today. We've got Conor Garrity here, who is a senior engineer from the Active Travel Unit in Laoghaire-Rathdown County Council, and he is managing this project. We also have John Montgomery from NMP, who are the landscape architects on this particular scheme, and Rory Collins from Barry Transportation Limited, who are the lead engineers on the project, and they're managing the consortium. So we've got the key team members here today to answer some of your questions. And really what we hope from today is that you leave understanding a bit more about the scheme. You have a sense of its key design features, what it might look like, and that you get a chance to listen to what the project team are saying about the project and ask any questions that you have. So obviously that's a key function of today, is that you can raise questions with the wide group of team members that we have. We ask that you do that through the chat function. So you'll all have the black strip at the bottom of your screen, and there is a speech bubble within that. So you can type your questions there. You can type them throughout the webinar. We'll be starting with presentations, but as they arise and as they come to your mind, you can put them into the chat and we'll get to those questions at the end. Those questions will go directly to the panel as opposed to the general audience. We find that to be the most efficient way of getting through a good bulk of questions and also keeping everyone's anonymity. We will be recording the session today as well, so that can serve as a resource for people who want to kind of listen back and get a sense of the discussion that was coming through after the webinar itself. So we'll be posting that to the Dún Laoghaire website. And then obviously at the end of today, having learned more about the scheme, we'd love if you would go and make an official submission online, and we'll be sharing the link with you for that. So like I said, I'm joined here by Conor. Conor Garrity will come on next, and he's going to talk a little bit about the background to this scheme. Obviously, it's been in the works for a while, and it's an evolution of what we see there today that happened during the COVID response. Then I'm going to hand on to John Montgomery, and he is the lead landscape architect on the project, and he will go through some of the key scheme visuals and the drawings to give you a sense of what the project might look like. So after those two presentations, then we'll go into questions. And like I said, please put your questions through as they arise, as the thought arises. You can pop that into the chat. So we'll get to those questions towards the end of the webinar. So we won't keep you long. Like, it's a lovely evening. We don't have a huge amount of us here, so we'll go through this quite quickly, I think. And hopefully, again, as I said, this will serve as a resource for people who want to listen back. So next, I'm going to hand over to Conor, and he's going to take control of the presentation now. So we'll just do a quick switch around.
Thanks, Ruth, and hopefully everybody can see that.
Yeah, that looks good. Perfect.
Thanks, Ruth. So as Ruth said, I'm Conor Garrity. I'm Senior Engineer for Active Travel in DLR, and I'm leading on this project from the Dún Laoghaire-Rathdown section. So just initially to talk about the Living Streets project, it is a public realm improvement project which aims to enhance, and these would be our objectives, the attractiveness, livability, connectivity and economic vibrancy of Blackrock Village. I would assume that everybody in this call is aware of the works that were carried out during or in response to COVID during the middle of 2020, and this project is seeking to build on that and to further enhance the village to continue to improve the area. This scheme involves a number of different elements to it. So there is public realm improvements which incorporate better landscaping, more planting, seating throughout the town, and not only along the main street out into the wider area out as far as Frascati Road and down towards Newtown Avenue. It's hoped that this will create a safe, accessible and attractive environment, and then that will help to maintain but also to boost the economic vibrancy of the town. We hope to expand on the mobility options for the town, and while Blackrock is quite an easy place to cycle to further expand on the network and to connect into the coastal route with a new facility along the old main street, improving walkability and accessibility in the town at the moment. Obviously, with the response to COVID measures, there is a number of step changes across the town, and this scheme is looking to regularize that and to bring consistency across the town and create quite a high quality area that is accessible for all. As I mentioned, connecting spaces is important to the project, particularly with the discussions around the seafront and the existing projects that are in the area. We're trying to connect all of these spaces, and this project obviously lies in the middle of all of these schemes. So it's important that we consider now that at this situation. Provision for parking is obviously important. There is an increase in disabled parking spaces in the town. The number of loading bays remains the same, and there is a loss of parking, but it's minimal in comparison to the amount of additional features that we've included in the scheme. So I won't cover too much on this slide because John is going to take us through the detail of it, but essentially this gives a snapshot of some of the features that I mentioned, and starting at the top left, looking to reduce some of the existing carriageway space and replace it with pedestrian areas as well as high quality planting. The square area in the village to enhance that even further and to make it a very much a focal point within the village. On the right hand side, the continuation of the contraflow facility completes the link and the connection to the coastal mobility route. And the two on the bottom and the bottom left are some of the representations, and John will go through these in a bit more detail shortly. The benefits to the scheme, and I've covered these already, but again, improved walkability and accessibility, making it easier to get to the town by sustainable travel modes and connecting spaces, improving the green in the town and improving landscaping in line with our climate change objectives, and to enhance the community well-being as well as the vibrancy of the town. In terms of the history of the scheme, there's a strong policy basis as far back as 2015 when the local area plan was adopted, and within that plan, even back then, it identified the need for streetscapes, upgrades, active travel mobility, and enhanced connectivity. So the first step on this journey then was rolled out during 2020 in response to COVID. One of the most significant changes was the making one way of the street, which allowed or freed up space to provide other measures like the contraflow cycle facility and increased planting. And this was worked or developed in consultation and co-designed with BBN and BVRAG at the time. In 2021, TU Dublin carried out an independent evaluation of the Blackrock scheme, and this was to very much assess had the measures that were put in during COVID had a positive impact on the village, and if they did, what should we do next? So that very much established that the scheme was positive and that it should be retained but built on, and that's what we've been working on in 2022 and so far in 2023. So at the moment we are in a public consultation process in the statutory Part 8. So this webinar forms part of that engagement process, and the next steps would be to report back on the consultation for a decision made by the elected members. Within the existing local area plan, there was a need, and I mentioned it already, to identify, or there was a need identified to upgrade the public realm on the main street to provide a more attractive streetscape and an improved pedestrian environment, and this project seeks to achieve that. And it was also an objective to reduce the volume of through traffic, and the measures that were provided during COVID achieved that. There are obviously a number of other projects in the area, so the seafront project and the discussions around it, as well as Bus Connects, are two key projects that sit either side or through this project. So as part of our scheme, it was very important from the outset to make sure that these schemes could all work together. In particular, the need to move the bus terminus from the existing space near the seafront would have to be facilitated in order to progress the seafront project. So as part of this scheme, we successfully negotiated an alternative space for the bus layover facilities. And while we don't need to move the buses at this stage, having that agreement with the NTA facilitates the progression of the seafront project. The Bus Connect scheme, and there's generally two parts to that. There's the change of services, the numbering and frequency of buses, and that's facilitated within this project. But then there's the wider Bus Connect scheme, which is currently with Bord Pleanála, and that deals with the Rock Road and down as far as Marion Gates. So this project aligns with that scheme as well, and the three projects work well together. I had mentioned earlier that the TU Dublin report was done and it assessed the measures that were put in during COVID, and the findings from that, sort of the highlight findings, were 84% of residents surveyed believe that the main street was good for the village. 72% of businesses would like to see the changes made permanent, and we very much took that support as a mandate to go and prepare the Part 8 for this scheme. 43% of those surveyed would like to see some design changes, and the recommendations that came through in that report have been incorporated into this scheme. And obviously loading and deliveries are a key issue for businesses, and during the discussions that we've had, we've been mindful to incorporate those needs as part of this project. So before the Part 8 was proposed, we had a number of different workshops, both internally in Dún Laoghaire and externally with the National Transport Authority, who are the lead authority in relation to bus routing. We also met with the Blackrock Business Network and the Blackrock Village Rejuvenation Action Group and had various discussions about what they need or would like to see in the village, as well as the schemes in the wider area and these objectives and these needs. And we've tried to respond to these as best as we can within this Part 8. We also met with the DLR Disability Consultation Group to talk about matters relating to universal design and accessibility and needs for those with disabilities within the village. So at this point, I'm going to hand over to John Montgomery, who's the lead landscape architect for the project, and he's going to talk through some of the design features of this scheme.
Thanks, Connor. I'll just try and make sure I share the correct screen here, and hopefully you can see that. Hi there, my name is John Montgomery. I'm a landscape architect with Neil Montgomery and Partners, architects and landscape architects. So I'll try to give you an overview of the design and the design drivers that have kind of led us to where we are in the actual process of the public realm improvements. And there's three key elements which are driving that. One is about authenticity, so about Blackrock and that sense of place that you have. There's life on the street, so that active and vibrant element. And then there's the idea of just celebrating space and spaces that are within the town centre, the village itself. The idea of authenticity is really trying to understand that centre place, or Jeans Lotai, as we call it. And that's kind of based on three elements. So there's authenticity, there's understanding context, both the historical context, but also the geographical context as well. And how they can play into how the town village has formed over time and how it links into different areas, why such spaces are in certain areas and how it's evolved essentially. There's the idea of heritage as well, which is really important. And essentially what we're seeking to do here is not create a public realm that's going to compete with the architecture, but is going to complement it, and really try to use the idea of memory and those artifacts within the buildings, within the views, within elements such as the stone cross, as markers within the public realm as well, elements that haven't been forgotten but are really celebrated as well. The other idea of that, or how we kind of express it, is in our use of materials as well. So again, not competing with that architecture, but trying to find the right materiality, both hard landscape and soft landscape, paving materials, planting, that are going to highlight areas and really use them as that palette for us to be able to paint this design on. The second element is about life on the street. There's clearly, a huge amount of vibrancy, particularly, after some of the temporary works, the COVID works that have been put in place. And that's driven by a good offer in terms of retail, F&B, and all the other elements that are in there, shops, so on and so forth. Using that, drive, that existing footfall, but creating kind of a more enhanced space for that will only help, I think, some of those spaces. So thinking about space itself and what makes a great street is the idea of social spaces, and some of those areas are outside shops where you have seating for cafes, the active frontage element. Some of it is about areas where you just might go and sit and watch people watch, or gather or wait for people to meet people, and all of that is bringing vibrancy and activity onto the street and really kind of creating a sense of community, but also a sense of safety as well. In how the street feels. So the idea that you would, stop, sit, stay, you might go and pay for your coffee, you may just sit and bring your own coffee with you, or you may arrange to meet with people as well. There are elements that are providing opportunities for interactions and engagement within the village itself, and creating a really nice sense of a community, building on something that's already there to enhance it even further. In terms of celebrating the space, I think it's about identifying key nodes and parcels, and we'll look at that a little bit later in the presentation. So it's about where are the arrival points, the gateways, key nodes outside some areas which naturally have more space outside them, widenings in the actual village on the main street, or areas that are already celebrated, such as up outside the bank and the library itself. So understanding those spaces and how we can work with them, making them more comfortable, making them safe and surveilled, well lit for nighttime, extending those hours where it can be used. But really importantly as well, I think it's about trying to find opportunities for greening the spaces. And in a village that, you know, is old and historic, it's difficult and it's a challenge to get those elements in there when you're trying to provide for the needs of people movement, of vehicle, of bikes, of various different modes of transport as well. So bringing all those elements in together, but making them feel safe and well used, well respected places. The core areas that we're going to touch on briefly are about the village entrance, or the gateway, and a point of departure also. Typical kind of streetscape that we're looking at, and that'll give an idea, sense of materiality, planting, and how the spaces begin to work in terms of scale. The junction itself as well, which is, you know, one of these core spaces and offers lots of opportunity for spill out, but also for fixed seating as well within that. Pocket Park, or the square that we have up outside the bank and centre and that zone, and the library as well, just as examples of how we're approaching the design. And for, if there's any further interest, obviously the detailed plans are available for download on the website itself as well. The village entrance, really what we're trying to do here is take advantage of the removal of the filter lane, but also celebrating the space and that arrival or sense of arrival into the village itself using planting. And that very much is a reflection of what's been done at the entrance to the Blackrock shopping centre as well. Trying to tie those two elements in together, an opportunity for signage, still allowing for people movement across the space, but really making it quite identifiable and memorable, utilizing soft landscape in how we do that, and providing those elements for increased planting and obviously for a net gain for biodiversity in that respect as well. The next area that we're looking at is just a typical streetscape. So those of you familiar with the village itself will recognize this from the School of Rock. So what we're really doing is narrowing down the roadway, allowing for cyclists to use a shared surface in one direction and bringing cyclists back in the other direction on the actual footpath on the cycle track itself. There's a provision for seating, for tables, so you can bring your own coffee that you might have bought, or you can just sit in the sun, read a book, whatever it might be. And then there's lots of opportunity for spill out spaces as well, which will require a little bit further detail in terms of how that gets governed, etc. And then really utilizing opportunities for providing planting in the streetscape itself as well, which will soften up the spaces a lot more throughout the actual year. So providing green, so you can see from the visual that it's much softer, there's less gray in the actual street itself, more green, evergreen planting to complement and give structure to some of the herbaceous planting perennials that we're mixing in, and that will really help us in terms of, you know, pollinator plants as well that have been selected for the scheme. And that's just a plan view of how that works. So you can see currently at the moment, there's 2 car parking spaces in this zone in here. And what we've actually done is just realign the road to create more space. This is the zone just outside the parlour on both sides of the road. So you're really taking advantage of the sun and the aspect of this zone in this case as well. Provision of bike parking also, which is currently there, and additional bike parking for cargo bikes as well. And protecting these edges using planting in the landscape. So it's a very functional tool as well as an aesthetic drive as well. The loose seating, again, you know, this is indicative and that will require a little bit further thought in how that gets laid out and is agreed. Again, the detailed plans which are available to be viewed. The space outside the bank itself, currently very, very well used. There's seating there, there's planting. And really what we're doing here is celebrating that square and allowing for flexibility. But what we're very conscious of is trying to create a space which is well protected from the road itself, still provides a focal point within the village. And then all of that seating around the edges that I'm pointing to right now is utilized as well. We've allowed for clear width and access up along the side, so people can kind of move around the edge of the space if they don't want to go through it or permeate through it. And that's just based on some of the feedback that we've had from some various user groups as well. There's additional bike parking provided along the edge of the path. Again, we still have our clear widths to make it adequate for people in wheelchair users, for buggies, and those less able-bodied as well, being able to move through the space. In addition to that, the space is approximately similar kind of area to what it is currently. We're retaining the stone cross as well, but really trying to create a space, like I say, that's safe and kind of away from the noise of the actual street itself. The visual which I'm showing now still needs a little bit of work on what we're presenting, but there has been comments about the existing trees, trying to retain the existing birch trees, but also the clipped hedge, which is quite close to the edge. So they're details that will begin to flesh out as we progress with the actual scheme. But the sense and the design intent, I think, is clear that you're creating a space which is a little bit lower down, away from the traffic, feels like it's enclosed, feels like it's safe. So, you know, it plays a different role in that kind of sensory experience of landscape. You still have your controlled crossings through the actual space as well to link you beyond, and then really celebrating the idea of planting and the existing trees there as well, which tie in with the buildings. And then the final space that we'll look at is outside the actual library itself. So again, understanding how the space is used at the moment, and to a degree all those spaces, and really trying to utilize those spaces as a catalyst for that vibrancy that we were talking about. So celebrating, in this case, the entrances into the library itself, utilizing some of the space directly outside the libraries with soft landscaping to give a better interface between the ground plane and the actual library building itself. There's opportunities for seating within some of these zones, still providing a safe kind of transition through the space for pedestrians. So you have a transition zone, you have these static zones, and then integrating the bike path as well. Still retain the car park spaces outside the library itself, and you have the mobility impaired spaces also. And again, the detailed plans which can be referred to. Just in terms of details, typically what we'll be looking at is natural stone, very kind of warm granite paving, very similar to what's been put in Monkstown and also along the metals in Dún Laoghaire as well. So it's the same suite of materials that we're using. We'll be looking to detail the cycle path itself. So in some instances it's flush, and that actually helps us slow down bicycle traffic. And then in other instances, just keeping it away from the actual road in both cases, in both scenarios. And that gives greater amounts of safety to cyclists, particularly those traveling with young children as well. The high friction surface will be utilized on the bike track itself as a red color. And then we'll be looking as a high friction surface through the village for a portion to help with that sense of a shared space going through the village, but also provides a much kind of warmer feel than the blacktop that's currently there. We have an edge to the buildings also, which will help tie in some of those difficult kind of nooks and crannies using smaller, kind of darker paving sets. And that helps to pick up any dirt or screen against any dirt as well. And this is just a little bit more detail on those actual materials, so you can get that kind of warmth coming through the granite. It's very durable, and it's been well tested on the other sides as well. There's been questions about the edges of the planted areas. Can they be slightly raised? And in some opportunities, we will be able to use, you know, the raised planters in Monkstown and across the metals as well. In other areas where we're trying to encourage water into the planted areas to use them to filter water as subsystems, we'll be using lower curves with holes within them to allow that process to occur naturally. Benches, we'll be looking at, again, something which is more in keeping with what's been very successful in other schemes throughout the county. And obviously bike stand and the opportunity for outdoor water fountain, drinking water fountain. Palette of materials, in terms of soft landscape, we'll really be looking to utilize native plant species. And that's both in the trees and also with the selected a shrub planting in the lower areas of the planters. Bike parking, again, I think we touched on this previously. The preference is for Sheffield stands. Obviously, there's issues with the lower bike stands and damage that they do. But in total, we're exceeding what's currently in place. And that will really help to, I guess, encourage people to cycle to Blackrock and be able to lock your bike safely. Bike parking has been distributed around in higher concentrations in certain areas where people are using it more, and lower concentrations in other areas, but always trying to ensure that it's surveilled and safe for people to lock bikes to. So I guess in terms of just kind of summarizing some of those elements, we've had good engagement with some of the user groups. You know, we're looking to reduce clutter and obstacles, so damaged boards, signage, you know, not having unnecessary regulatory signage or informational in that respect as well. Defined areas for retailers' furniture, so tables and chairs, so they can be kept neatly out of the way and there's not obstacles and zigzagging points for, you know, many users, people with good buggies, but also wheelchairs as well. The opportunity for tapping lines for visually impaired, contrasting materials at thresholds, be it curb lines, be it at crossing points for tactile paving, or actual thresholds into buildings as well. Looking to incorporate additional drop curves, again for the mobility impaired, but also for other users as well. Smooth and clean non-slip surfaces, so all of the surfaces that we'll be specifying will be aligned with the various different standards that we're required to meet. Again, tactile contrasting paving at crossing points, and then the disabled spaces which will be retained. So at this point, I think I'll hand back over to Ruth.
Perfect. Thanks a million, John. Hopefully everyone can hear me now. So yeah, thanks so much, John and Connor, for giving us a good overview of the scheme there. As Connor said, we are in the middle of our public consultation phase at the moment. It's a Part 8 public consultation, so that's a 6-week process. The survey has been up since 28th of April and it is online now at the link that we shared, and we can share that again in the chat on the Citizen Space website. We held a drop-in last week in the Blackrock Library. We've the webinar today, which will go as a resource online, and we're holding another pop-up in the village next Wednesday, which will be talking to people on the street about the project. So really trying to build awareness and engagement. We sent out flyers to over 9,000 households. We're trying to get posters up. So it's great to have you all here, but please do spread the word. We've had a few questions come through now through the chat function, and I can go through some of them now, but please do add some more there now, because we have everyone here to kind of go through some of those queries that you have. I'll start with one question that came in, and possibly this is for you, Connor, which is how long the works themselves would actually take to complete the scheme.
That's quite a tricky thing to estimate at this stage, Ruth. Yeah. So geographically speaking, the linear length of the streets are probably around 1 kilometre, but it very much depends on the detailed design. If there are service diversions required, you know, we might need to move lampposts or water mains or any of those kind of features if we're trying to get planting in. There is issues as well with permitted working hours. So generally working hours are 8 to 6, but if road closures were permitted, that would speed up construction time. If it gives it a sense of maybe Monkstown Village, the start to finish of 32 weeks. So if that gives a sense of it, this would obviously be bigger than Monkstown Village, but it could take anything 12 to 18 months, depending on the complexities of the detailed design.
Okay, thanks. Thanks, Connor. There was another question about the bus terminal, and this is probably for you or Rory even, and it was asking about where the bus terminal would go. I wasn't quite clear, but I think it was the question around if the Seafront Plaza goes ahead, where would the bus terminal that's currently outside the Dart station be moved to? And I know that the plan is for it to kind of split between Kerrisford Avenue and Rock Hill. I think that's what the question was about. So you might just give a bit more detail on that, please.
Yeah, I can take that, Ruth. If you want to just go forward, maybe 2 slides there. I think it's probably a more blown up version. It's probably slightly better, whoever is sharing at the moment. The other way.
John, you're sharing there. Are you okay? Which scheme are you looking for? The first?
I think it's slide number 2. I can share here.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it's the next one. That's the one. So what's shown on that slide is the provision for the 2 bus bays. So there's a couple of things to note. what we've reached is agreement with the NTA that the buses could be the bus terminus and the layover spaces could be moved from the seafront, but they don't need to move from the seafront until or if the seafront scheme goes ahead. So for the moment where we've shown those 3 buses, they would just be normal parking spaces, but we've included in the geometric design of the street that that's where the buses would go. Quite hard to get context in that photograph, but the grey area to the top is the end of the Deepwell property. So on the northern side, as you look at it, so it's literally adjacent to the wall at Deepwell is where those 2 spaces are shown, and there is facility for a 3rd spot on Carysford Avenue, but that would only be required if 2 buses laid over and they needed a 3rd spot, which we don't think would be very common. So for the moment, even though the buses are shown there in the Part 8, the intention would be that would just be parking until it's needed into the future. So they will continue to use the seafront in the short term.
Okay, thanks a million, Conor. There was a question then, I suppose this is kind of linked to the construction question, which was when would you start building it, you know, if this is to go ahead, when would it happen?
So if we get the current programme is to bring the report back to the elected members in the July full council meeting, and assuming a positive outcome at that point, we would move to detailed design. So detailed design, as I mentioned already, depending on the complexity, could take a number of months or even up to 6 months, and then there's a tender period. So we generally, even if we were ready, we wouldn't start works on, you know, November, December time of the year because of the Christmas period. So with a fair wind and all things going well, we would hope to start in maybe Q1 24. Obviously, we have to go through a lot of reporting and funding issues to get to that point, but certainly early in the year would be preferable, Ruth.
Okay, great. So 2 other questions then, which were about electric points on the main street, particularly to facilitate Christmas lighting. And then another point about signage. Will direction signage and signage into the village be improved, and could that happen as part of this scheme?
Yeah, so what we generally do, particularly for Christmas trees, is that you try to get underground power and sockets so that the tree can be dropped into the socket. It doesn't need an above ground concrete reinforcement to keep it upright. So again, Monkstown is probably a good example where all of the electrical work and the socket is there, and you just lift the lid and it can be piped into it. So that's something that's relatively straightforward. So they would be sort of detailed design issues that we would look at as part of detailed design. The question about signage, generally we try to declutter places is the first step, and then only put up required signage. So it depends on the type of signage, but generally, yes, we provide the statutory signage, the bare minimum statutory signage, and then if there's additional information or wayfinding signage, then we look at that as part of detailed design. But if there's a particular type of sign, Ruth, I think that's the kind of comments we're hoping to get from public consultation.
Okay, great. So if anyone has any more ideas on that, definitely send them through. Is there any other questions from anyone there? I mean, we've been through most of the ones that have come through via the comments, but if anyone else has anything else, speak now or put it through to the Citizen Space consultation. I'm putting the link there again to the Citizen Space website, and within that web page, if you click down the bottom, there's a link that says give us your views, and that's where you get through to the survey itself. So, you know, you might take a bit of time to reflect on what you've heard. You know, it's quite hard to kind of formulate an opinion straight away, maybe. So take a bit of time, go back over what your notes from the webinar or whatever, and make a submission online. You can do it as an individual or as a group on behalf of an organization. If you're here representing a broader group, you can make a group submission or an individual submission, and we'd ask you to share that link to your friends, to WhatsApp groups, etc. And yeah, so definitely spread the word. I think we've got most of the questions done now, so we might just close off there.